our last panel, I think we should all give you a hand for sitting indoors all day and surviving. All right, working the publishing world. So as you've learned, the publishing world can be exclusive, filled with gatekeepers. And this panel is sort of about people who are the gatekeepers, but are themselves writers and creators. So part of what we can talk about is how do you navigate this often inaccessible world, and how do you work as a writer within that world. So our moderator is Katie Raissian, who's the founder of Stonecutter Journal and an editor at Grove Atlantic. From right to left, we have Ryan Chapman, who's at Bomb Magazine and the author of Conversation Sparks. Next, James Yeh, who's the founder of Gigantic, as well as an editor at Vice. And Rakesh Satyal, who's the author of Blue Boy and editor at Atria. Let's give them a hand. I just want to also do one last shout out and thank you to Basil, our photographer, Issue Project Room, for sticking out here. Nadia, who you've seen running around all day, doing a lot of work. All the interns and volunteers, including Tracy Wong, who, if you're using a discount code, it's partly because of her. Let's give them all a hand.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Thank you, Ken Chen, for inviting us to be here and for that lovely introduction and that little dance. That was great. And thanks to Kirby Kim and Jin Ah as well for organizing this and the Asian American Writers Workshop, which is such a great space. So we're here to talk about the publishing world. We have three very esteemed publishing professionals with us who are also writers. So before we get into an overall discussion on the structure of the publishing world, I just wanted to ask each of you the same question. How did you get your start in publishing? And also, what does your publishing world look like? We can start with Rekesh.
Hello. So my first publishing job was an internship before my senior year of college. I worked for a legendary editor named Jerry Howard, who is still at Doubleday. He had quite a year last year with Hanya Yanagihara's Little Life, which is a masterpiece in my view. So Jerry was a very good mentor early on, and actually when I graduated from college, I started working for him the Monday after I graduated from school. So I spent 10 years in publishing. I was at Doubleday and then HarperCollins, and then I actually had a 3-year detour outside of publishing where I worked in brand naming. And then I came back to publishing last February at Atria, which is a division of Simon & Schuster. So, so kind of 10 plus years of publishing experience. And in terms of the world of it, one of the things I like about Atria in particular where I work is that we have an incredibly diverse editorial team. Actually, staff in general, beyond just editorial, which makes my perspective on the people in our office somewhat different from other publishing offices because there is a little bit more diversity at the imprint itself.
Hi. So I got my start, I guess the start would probably be at the Columbia MFA program, and where I was the managing editor of the Columbia Journal, and then I sort of interned. Actually, one could say even I was just trying to think of the exact answer to that, and I don't know if this is common to all of you guys, everyone here, but it's in some ways very hard to. It's not easy to just like pinpoint it because I could actually say, well, I did like work on my undergraduate, literary magazine a little bit, even though I didn't like it very much. I was like, oh, I guess I'm a writer now, I guess, so I should join it. And I was going to say, oh, but then I remembered I read submissions for McSweeney's before I went to grad school. So it's like I think the thing for me was just saying yes to a lot of things, just trying to get internships, and finding places that I was excited about. I tried to, the McSweeney's submissions reader was actually because I didn't get the internship, because I was too nervous at the interview. So it's like, but anyway, sort of through that murky place, at Columbia, I met a few other writers. I started a literary magazine called Gigantic. And we've put out 6 issues once a year since then. And then over the last year and a half, I've worked at Vice as the culture editor. And so, I think the other question was what Vice is like. Vice is if you're not familiar, is a sort of large, very large media company. We're sort of that started from a punk magazine, and we have a lot of different arms, including an HBO series, a TV channel that we just launched called Viceland, and then we also have a print mag, and then I work on the website primarily, vice.com, and we have like a sort of cover anything from culture to politics and news and crime.
Ryan?
I started working in publishing about 10 years ago. What month is it? Like 10 years ago last week.
Happy anniversary.
Yay, I'm still broke. I had moved to New York. I was very lucky because I was working for a Seattle company. I could work from home until they had no more work for me. And I think my 200th or 250th application netted an interview with Macmillan, and I was very lucky. I think luck played a huge part in getting my first job in publishing. And I worked with Macmillan in their nascent digital marketing department and worked pretty closely with Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and then wholly with them a little bit afterwards. So I worked with them I was there for about 5 years, and then spent a busy and ill-fated year with Penguin Press, where I got to work on some excellent books. And then a year with a startup, which we can talk about, but isn't around anymore. Some freelancing, and then a couple of years ago, landed at Bomb Magazine. And now my publishing world is a little unique in that Bomb is a nonprofit arts magazine. So we can publish extremely non-commercial work, and my role is in marketing and events and digital projects. So I don't work in editorial, which means I can just gush about how great the editorial is there. We can talk about it later, but if you guys don't know, Bomb publishes conversations between artists. It's celebrating its 35th anniversary right now. It started with visual artists, and they also publish short fiction, poetry. A few of the panelists today have been in Bomb, and our offices are a 10-minute walk eastward in Fort Greene.
So what I'm getting from each of you, and this has been my experience too of publishing, is you move around a lot, and sometimes you don't necessarily go in straight as an editor, or sometimes you just don't want to be an editor, like Ryan. I just want to take a quick survey before we continue. How many of you want to work in publishing? Wow, all right. And of those people, how many of you want to be editors? Just a few of you. Nice, I like that. And how many of you are writers as well? Okay, because these guys are all also amazing writers. So can we talk a little bit about the entry point into publishing and the need to move around and the need to kind of switch things up? I mean, I feel like for the people who want to be in the industry in this audience, it might be, useful. I always say to interns or people who work with me, you don't need to get an editorial job as your first port of call. You can work your way through it and get to it eventually. Do you guys have anything to add to that in terms of your own experience? I could direct it to Ryan. Yes.
I think what I think a lot of us know is that there's a lot of competition for any job in publishing, and I always felt like I was competing with everybody else in the country who would move to take my job and be willing to get paid less to do so. And so I think that creates an industry where you find a lot of people are getting by because they have maybe support of family members financially, or they have like a partner who is the breadwinner. And I think that creates the need to move around because there just isn't a lot of mobility within the companies. People who are in the middle or top positions rightfully want to stay there. And it's also this odd industry, which I think like being an editorial is like the key to longevity because you have a lot of editors who are like in their 80s and 90s and still doing great work. And it's, if you're their assistant and you're getting paid crap and you've been there for 12 years, that sucks for you. So I think you do need to move around a lot.
I mean, I'll be pretty frank with you that, I didn't, like when I got to Columbia 10 years ago, also 10 years seems to be the threshold to sit here. But
I'm gonna break that. I'm 7, so I'm the baby.
Yeah, but yeah, so when I first got here 10 years ago, I wasn't planning to be an editor. I thought it was kind of cool, but I saw myself very much as a writer who, well, I edit my own stuff, right? So, I kind of, and through but I sort of didn't, so I actually was like thinking I might teach instead. I would be like a very famous writer who could also teach. That was the sort of idea going into Columbia, and I think some of my classmates have, there's a whole wide range of sort of how things pan out, and for me, I sort of, because of the classwork was really, I had some really great teachers who sort of taught me a lot of things, and I got a lot of experience. I also interned at the New Yorker in the fiction department while I was at Columbia, and all these kind of things started to basically lead me to the point where some of my classmates and I decided to start a magazine together. And this was while I was interning there at that time when we started Gigantic in 2008. I was interning at the New Yorker 2 days a week for $12 a day. And which was the stipend that you get. Yeah, and then I was working 2 or 3 days a week as a literary agent's assistant, which I had sort of connected through Columbia. And I was going, just not making clearly enough money to live here and very stressed out. And, I was I've taught high school kids, I've taught elementary school kids, I've worked as a professional mover in the last few years. And, and then sort of that was actually a turning point for me, which was I really liked it for a while, and then I hated it. And it became clear to me that I should try to find work at something that maybe I am good at, or have some experience at. And I sort of still kind of think maybe I should just be totally freelance as a writer. But for me, editing is very good in that it uses a lot of the things I went to school for, and some of I've met a lot of writers, I've met a lot of editors and people in publishing, so I know a lot of people there, and so it was sort of a very, very good day job, a day job I couldn't have imagined having 10 years ago. But I think at the end of the day, I still when I walk around and no one's looking, I'm a writer. So I don't know how that is about everyone, but it was for me, it was just editing was the best day job I could have to support myself while I still get my feet together, get my footing as a writer, and still am getting it at.
I think it's a really good question, first of all, because the general kind of tenet you're talking about is that people who want to go into publishing want to go into editorial because they want to have, they want to be involved creatively with the books, they want to be acquiring books, they want to be shaping them and working, kind of the way James is saying, using their skills, the kind of corporate embodiment of their academic interests, so that translates over from studying literature, for example. But it is a very important question because I kind of get on my soapbox a lot these days and talk about how people talk about representation and diversity in publishing on the editorial end, but it's actually sometimes even more dire on in the other components of the office, and particularly on the sales department. Because the truth is, as a publishing person, when you present your titles at a launch meeting or at a sales conference meeting, it's very rare for you to look at a room of salespeople and see anybody of color. And the truth is, if you think about the actual role of a salesperson, is to pitch books and get people to buy them, get the accounts to buy them. And I really encourage anybody who seems just passionate about books in general, more so to think beyond editorial, because that we often have to say that to people, to really think about the marketing and sales positions that are out there. Because if you're incredibly enthusiastic about books, that's where we really need representation. And I think, for example, I had an editorial assistant who I was sharing with another editor, and who was very bright and really passionate about books. He's run a book blog for a long time and got in that space early. And he realized about several months after working for us that actually what he really wanted to do was be in marketing. And we kind of encouraged him in that too, because he really seemed to have some savvy in terms of how he would work in a marketing team. So he ended up leaving the company and going to work at St. Martin's to do that job. And it was really heartening to see that happen, because I think we do need people to realize that publishing origin stories don't have to be about struggling to find an editorial job, that actually publicity, marketing, sales really need people who are passionate about the industry.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And I also think that whatever role you do in publishing, whether it's in a house or in an agency or for a scouting agency, it's the sum of all parts. I don't think you're ever going to be told, well, that experience does not apply to this job. I think really anything that you can do as you kind of decide your path is really valuable. But you all kind of touched on ideas that I really wanted to get into, and that's the hot button conversation of the publishing industry right now is the D word, diversity, or equity, as I prefer to say, in publishing. I just have some context for you guys. There's been a lot of reports that have come out. 2015, we saw the Publishers Weekly diversity report, which I'll go back to, and then we also saw the Lee and Low Diversity Survey, which looked at a segment of the North American publishing landscape, surveying 34 publishers and 8 literary journals. And the results were that the publishing industry is hegemonously and overwhelmingly white and cisgendered. Employees are generally not incredibly paid. So it's kind of, a lot of people talk about class and classism in that respect. So I'm just going to read you some statistics because they're interesting. Obviously, this is a swath of the industry, but it's still a swath. So the Lee and Low Diversity Survey found that 88% of people working in publishing across the industry were straight, cisgendered. 78% were women, cis women. 79% were white. 7% were Asian. 4% were African American. 6% were Latinx. 3% were biracial or multiracial, and 1% were Middle Eastern. That's where I turned and I was like, oh, I'm finally part of the 1%. That's as close as I'm ever going to get to it. So, that's just a kind of the scope of the landscape. So for many of us, these numbers don't seem very hopeful. But then we're all here today as, diverse members of the publishing community. So I wanted to talk to each of you gentlemen about, your personal experiences with diversity and equity in the publishing world, and if you guys have, anything to speak to in that sense. It's a big question, right? Just not making it easy for them. As the woman, I get to do that. Will we start with Ryan?
Yeah.
Go on, Ryan.
It is odd that, I know when I was hired, because I look white, a lot of people assume I'm white, and it was the department Ryan was hired into was at the time 3 women, and they're like, well, if we hire a guy, that'll balance it out. And that is a rare thing in America, where the straight guy who they think is white is the diversity hire. It says a lot. I'm an optimist who's undergone kind of a shitty week because of the news, so I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I think on the one hand, the amazing thing about publishing in the last 10 years that I've seen is that there has been much more diversity on like the publishing side, like the writers side, I think, while the staffing has remained pretty like underrepresentative of reality. And I don't know how, like, if that's just like a generational thing, like we just have to wait for a lot of people to retire, because it seems like right now it's like the Ivy League funnel up to like like a white Ivy League educated person will get the publishing job, and then I think that a lot of the statistics we see, they try to like I don't know how they collect them, but I think the depressing thing is that a lot of times, like the diversity doesn't at all reflect like who's making the decisions in the publishing house. It's very rare to see people of color in editorial, and I've seen a lot of publishing houses where the sole African American employee would be the receptionist, and that isn't talked about that much, but it has this kind of terrible air of tokenism that like, oh, like we have African American receptionist, and then editorial is all white. And I don't know, do you guys think it's just like, what's gonna cause the shift? Is there gonna be, is it age or what?
I mean, I think it's a valid point in terms of generational difference. I think that happens very often. I don't really, I can't say this with any kind of great credibility, I guess, but I do feel like I know a lot of editors of color who are not valued. They're not, they get laid off, or they are not paid attention to, and it does smack of tokenism sometimes. But after a certain point, it started to dawn on me. I was like, oh, a lot of these people are being overlooked or let go. And it is happening. I won't name names here, but there's one editor in particular whom I really, really admired as I was coming up in publishing. And it just didn't seem like anybody ever really valued her perspective as a minority. And she was successful. I mean, she was a good editor. She could scope out talent. She knew what she was doing. And it was really disheartening for me to look at it and think, if this is the person I'm trying to emulate and nobody seems to be valuing her opinion and her taste, it is very discouraging. So I think more so than just the statistics, sometimes I do feel like there is a tendency not to kind of trust the instincts of that person, because there is this idea of like the ideal straight white male who has great authority. So I think simply acknowledging it to begin with is part of the issue here. And I think that we have to start realizing that there is a generational difference where people have really upheld this ideal of that editor who has more credibility and more authority than other people. And I am an optimist too, in the sense that I think I do see younger editors that I really think are smart, who do represent a kind of diverse readership and editorial staff, and I put my faith in those people, hopefully.
Let's talk a second about the straight white man that you brought up. I do want to shift over and talk about, gender and sex is something that's just come up, not racy, hot sex, unfortunately, but in the publishing industry. And as, you three are guys, I'm the woman here, and you're also published writers. I feel like it would be a missed opportunity for me not to ask you, about this idea that publishing is dominated by women in particular. And you talked, Ryan, about being hired as almost like the token man, by three women. I just want to read again the Publishers Weekly Diversity Survey that I mentioned earlier. It said, and I'm quoting directly, "In addition to having difficulty hiring people of color, publishers have also been unable to attract more men to the profession," which is ironic today. But women accounted for 77% of survey respondents in 2014, up from 74% in 2013. Men accounted for only about 15 respondents with fewer than 3 years experience, but they made up 27% of respondents with 11 to 21 years of experience and 54% of employees with more than 21 years on the job. So you see the longevity, as the longevity increases, the percentage of men increases. You know, writers like Claire Vaye Watkins and her essay On Pandering, and Marlon James, who responded to On Pandering, you know, that they've conversely written about their experiences as writers in these particular situations within the industry. And like, I also want to say, you know, the statistics are statistics, and we actually don't, I wasn't surveyed at any point, and I don't know if you guys were, so I don't know who's taking these surveys either, so, you know, they're numbers. But I want to read a quote from On Pandering, because Claire Vaye Watkins says, "The truth is, the fact that our culture considers male writers more serious than me was not a revelation. We live in a culture that hates us. We get that. Myself, I have been writing to impress old white men." In conversation and in response to this, Marlon James posted on Facebook regarding both editors and readers, "We writers of color spend way too much time pandering to the white woman. Writing that is astringent, observed, clipped, wallowing in its own middle-style prose and private ennui, porn for certain publications." So he's talking about an elitism in magazine publishing in particular. I just wanted to ask, you know, each of you what you think about these issues of gender, and especially, you know, white women being perceived as the more dominant force in the industry. First, like, you can answer as editors, and then maybe as writers as well, and just, you know, your perception of this issue happening. Rakesh, I guess let's start with you.
I think, I mean, there was a moment, I think, later in my kind of first iteration of my publishing career where I started to realize that people had an idea that there were a lot of gay men who worked in publishing, but actually a lot of the gay men I knew were no longer in publishing. They had all been laid off, or they had been fired, or they went elsewhere. And so I was very discouraged by that, and I thought that there was a certain perception that there were more of us than there actually were. So again, I go back to the idea of just acknowledging that that's probably the case, and I think people have a tendency to forget that, or they overlook it and they don't want to engage with it, because I definitely, there are moments where I think, oh, okay, I'm a queer man of color in publishing. How many of us are there? And I remember there was a submission that had gone out by a writer I really admire who's a queer man of color, and I decided to make a little list. I was like, what other queer editors of color might have this in publishing? And it was like 2 people, maybe, if I could do that. So, so I do think it's an issue. I think that there are plenty of people who are queer and or of color who want to work in publishing, and we need to be open to that idea and give them opportunities to work in publishing. It's as simple as that, I think. And in terms of the pandering, I mean, I think both of those perspectives are valid, and I think they're true. What I would say is that, both as a writer and a publishing person, a lot of the books that have excited me have been books that really break that mold. The Vegetarian is an amazing book, that book, and it's really unlike a lot of fiction that has been published to great effect in the past several years, if ever. And so there are certain works that you can point to and say, okay, that's not really pandering to anything. That's a real one writer's very, very firm perspective. And it's all the more important for us to champion work like that because it does make a difference.
Absolutely. James, do you want to speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to speak a bit to just the idea that, I mean, clear, like it's based, you know, from the statistics and from just anecdotally in our own experiences is, you know, I think there's a lot of, the system has some problems, right? And I think one of the, you know, there's like sort of a couple different ways of trying to improve, like to address the problems and solve the problems, right? And, you know, like there's, the most radical is to either, you know, sort of go outside the system to, you know, start a new system, or to burn down, actually that's like the ending of On Pandering, right, is that she wants to sort of burn the system. And, you know, I mean, it's the other, right, I think the other end, which is the less radical way would be maybe to sort of try to find a way to work within the system and then help change the system from within. You know, and I think for me, I don't know what is. I think both have their places, and because the system has got so many problems, I think any kind of way of addressing it, whether it's, you know, I think things are I think getting better in that there's actually like this is an issue now. You know, whether it's like Oscar So White or you know, that was like another like you know, in the whole arts and culture industry it is a very white place, right? It's a very people of color place. There are not a lot of people of color, and there are not a lot of sort of alternative perspectives that are presented and sort of given time and care. I think over the last few years, though, I think there really is becoming more awareness of that's a problem, and that's something actually that's not just a problem ethically, but a problem economically. And I think one of the things that, you know, people or publishers, and, you know, certainly from like the perspective of like Vice, where, you know, and my own perspective is like online media, like you know, it's like, it isn't only, like, we're clearly seeing that, like, actually, you know, I think one of the old excuses for not, like, publishing, let's say, like, a queer writer of color, or, like, might be like, oh, but who's gonna buy that book, you know? Or, like, oh, we're gonna, I love that idea, you know, like some Hollywood guy or whatever, I mean, I love that idea, but just, like, you know, like, I don't know, like, will people watch a movie with like a black guy as the like main actor? Like, I you know, like.
Or we already have that.
Yeah, yeah, and like, oh.
You know, we already have our queer writer of color book, or our African book, or, you know, where you're like,
yeah,
no, there's more space.
And one of the things I think is so that, like, I don't know, like, we're seeing, like, for instance, like, I mean, it's not exactly a beautiful work of art, like a transcendent work of art or something, but, like, you know, Star Wars was like starring like a woman and a black guy. Like, those were like the two sort of main characters, and it was like the great, you know, the biggest box office like success in period, you know, like ever, you know. And then you see like.
Star Wars fan, James.
Say what?
You're a Star Wars fan, aren't you?
Yeah, you know, and so we just have to look to Star Wars. But, you know, like, people like TV people are realizing, like, hey, like, Empire was like really, really successful, has been really, really successful. Master of None is like, you know, not quite as like many viewers, but it's like a big, really big deal. And, like, you know, these are shows that are breaking the mold of like what, and like these are works of like very large, like, blockbustery culture that actually like are being shown to have like economic value as well. And I think that's part of it, is like, people, you know, it's like at the end of the day, like, I think people want to be doing the right thing, but they also want to be paying their bills, or like, you know, and being able to like meet whatever the investors or the, like, you know, demands, and those are real things, you know. And it's like advice, you know, for instance, it's like we see that, like, you know, like there are certain things that'll drive traffic, and it's not just like really conventional things, you know. It's like, for instance, like the Oscars, like, and like racism, and like those are like issues that people really want to read about, and like, and so it's like not just like an ethical imperative to be like, hey, like there's something fucked up happening, let's like do a story on it, or several. It's like, hey, actually this is something that people, like, we're serving our readers in several ways, and we're also like, it's also like just like what we have to do to survive as a business. And so I think the awareness that it's like not just like the good thing to do, the right thing to do, but also like the thing like a necessary thing to do,
yeah.
is like an awareness that's like increasingly becoming a thing, and hopefully will continue. But, you know, there's a lot of problems, and you know, I think it's, and just to talk a little bit, or just to like go back to set, like, I was kind of flip about like, oh, it's a great day job being an editor, you know. Like, one of the things that, like,
I was wondering when you said that, I was like, that's.
I was a little bit flip, I guess.
Very optimistic.
Yeah, but like, I mean, something that's very important as someone in, like, with seats of like some kind of relative power, I think, is a responsibility. And it's like, you know, as a commissioning editor of color, who is very also like, I'm very interested in like gender parity and like just getting all different perspectives out there as much as like as well as I can. You know, it's like I as a commissioning editor, your job is like to choose the story that gets talked about, who writes the story, and how the right story is told. You know, and that is a tremendous amount of power and responsibility. And like, you know, I've had talks with various friends of color who are just like, yeah, like you're like one of the only few people who has like that kind of ability right now, like who is a person of color, or who is, let's say, an Asian guy. Like, and it's just like it's I don't know. There's something about just being sort of representing. I think, like literally.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I mean, I wanted to ask, I also have my own ideas and opinions on why the dominant kind of workforce in publishing might look the way it is, and I also think pay rate is something to do with it, and I think women are traditionally in all sectors underpaid and not paid as much as men, so that also might be part of why we see these roles being, you know, filled by women. As well as needing unending patience and not working your way up the ladder so quickly. Okay, but my rant is over. I wanted to talk to you guys about, you know, the publishing process. I really want to talk to you about so much, but I know we only have 10 minutes left. You're all writers, so because this is a room full of writers, let's talk a little bit about, you know, your experiences getting your own writing published and your books. Have you ever hit industry walls that we've talked about? You know, can you just tell us a little bit about your experiences? Ryan, your book is so great. And
yeah, I mean, I hit a wall because like James didn't like my rip-off idea of another article he already published. So I think there's like, you know, there's still gatekeepers who are like closed-minded. I've had first-hand experience. But you know, I did the, like many people who come into publishing, I had like written a novel, and then an editor whose taste I really respected read it and was like, listen, this is definitely not the book to get published. And I was like, cool, worked on it for like 5 years, I'll just like put it in the drawer. And then worked on short things. And then I had a job at the aforementioned not named startup that I really didn't like. And so I had some free time at work, and I just started like drawing because I was looking at Excel all day and I was bored out of my mind. And weirdly, the drawings found an audience online, and that led to a book. So it was very tangential, and then the editor that found me didn't know my background at all, so I didn't. I think that it was very useful in having made a lot of connections in the industry, maybe when it came to the publication, because I knew what ways to like maybe avoid first-time author mistakes.
Can you tell us a little bit, like, can you give us some first-time author mistakes, just for any first-time authors? The Do's and the Don'ts by Ryan Chapman, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Well, I want to say specifically, you know, my book was illustrated trivia, and I know it's very different for literary fiction. And with my book, I was very lucky because most of my friends were novelists, and I'd come to think of that as the way that a writer represents their work and the way their work should be marketed or find an audience. And for novelists, I would say be very nice to your publicist because they work so much on your book without you knowing it. And it doesn't help if you're like, well, this, you know, Marlon James got this thing. Can I get that? And you're like, well, Marlon James got that after he won the Booker. So with mine, my Chronicle is a great publisher, and they said, you know, this book will, we're packaging it in a way that it will do well in like stationery stores. And I was like, not bookstores? They're like, don't worry about it. And so a lot of the work I did was, I guess, what are the mistakes? Yeah, I kind of knew to trust them on when they were saying things about like the book that struck me as, I didn't know. I was like, oh, this book looks, like it doesn't look important. It's like a square shape that looks like a child's book. They're like, yes, this shape does well on tables because like it fits well in the front, or it fits well next to the register, and if it's a little bit longer, they can't stack it, so they don't put it there. And I was like, whoa, like they thought about it, and they were like, this color hasn't been used on the cover in a while for books like it, so now it's like fresh. And I was like, oh, amazing. So that stuff was very helpful. What else? I don't know. It's like never say no to a chance to, I guess, be interviewed, or like no ask is too
Why
small.
we're all on this panel right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, mostly like, I was like, well, yeah, if Ken asked me to do something, I'll say yes, of course. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
What about you, Rakesh? Will you jump in and...
I love to tell this one story about so I was working in publishing at the time that my first novel was on submission, and I kept hearing, my agent, I should say, who was a very good agent, kept hearing that South Asian plus queer diminished the work instead of made it more appealing to people. And there was an editor, a very big editor at a very big publishing house, whom I will not name. He doesn't deserve it, but he literally said, I heard through a fellow editor friend who was in the editorial meeting, said the Indian thing is over. This is 2008, people. And the funniest thing was like, then Slumdog Millionaire won Best Picture. I was like, it's definitely not over. No, so that was discouraging. The good thing was the publisher who ended up publishing it did a really lovely job and really understood that its queerness was probably its biggest selling point, and there was an audience. So I don't think, but I have a new book coming out next year, and I don't think it's mere coincidence that both my editor and the publisher are gay. What we heard from a few editors was a lot of the times their editorial feedback was, we want something bigger to be happening here. And I kept thinking, because if you're going to write about minorities, it needs to be a big plot, and it needs to have, because you can't just have them being, they have to, much more has to be.
Just sitting and thinking.
Yeah, that's right.
So
that's
many
right.
that have gone before.
That's right. So so that was not great either, to hear that from certain people, but the people who got it really got it. And so, and then I'm somebody who works in publishing and knows to expect these things, and so I wasn't entirely surprised by it. But that said, there were the people who were passionate about it who really connected with the work. And so this idea of pandering and how you're thinking about things, that's why it is really important to sort of keep your vision in mind and to really kind of stay true to what you think your voice is, because there are all these variables over which you have no control, and the thing you have control over is your voice. And so I feel really confident in, like, for example, the project I have coming out next year. I have no idea how other people are going to react, but thankfully the people who were the kind of gatekeepers of that project saw it and understood it. So, kind of talking to what Ryan's saying is that you trust the publisher in terms of how they're going to market your work and how they commit to it. But it all begins with your really trying to work hard and really trying to capture that voice that you have, and knowing inherently, for example, that South Asian plus queer is not a problem. It's actually a good thing.
James, do you have anything to add? That was brilliantly stated. Do you have anything to add to that, James?
Those are
Because
really good.
you're editing. It takes you have your own literary magazine, which publishes, very esteemed, very literary work like Silvino Ocampo and Lydia Davis and infinite. I have some lists, some name lists that I prepared, but there's a huge, Edgar Currat, Atasa Moshfe, Deb Olin Unforth, Tao Lin. How different is it for you to publish, literary writing versus your work at Vice, which is a little more, nonfiction based and reportage based and personal?
I was just thinking when you were talking, Rakesh, a bit about the idea of on-pandering and the idea of just pandering, because, I think with like novels, for instance, and with fiction, I think it's a bit different than when you're trying to publish nonfiction. And I think the idea with nonfiction is a bit more, certainly I think just across the board, we're wanting writers to be fully formed and to have opinions and to have experiences that are fully their own, that they really, can really sort of share with the readers. But at the same time, there is, I think, a market for, when you were saying, what we need it to go big, and it's I'm thinking of it as someone who might be commissioning something about that book or that TV show or that movie. It's those big issues, when we are able to see them, can be the difference between whether it's easy to, it can be not, I don't want to say the difference between we're able to do it or not, but whether it makes immediate sense, it's oh shit, this deals with Stonewall in some way, and there's all this it's just there's a peg, we think in terms of pegs. And so I don't know if it's necessarily pandering, but I think it is good to search yourself. For me, I was I don't want to write about big issues, I don't want to when I was 10 years ago, and I don't even know if I want to write about being Asian. And it turns 10 years later now, I'm realizing also at the same time, as I've matured, is that's actually a really big part of what I can bring to the table. I don't only want to be an Asian writer, an Asian writer, quote unquote, but I'm a writer who has that experience and that background. So it's and it's important, I think, for me to be able to, and for us as writers to be able to use our background and experience, but to also, I think, figure out a way to connect it, not just to the white man or the white woman, but just to anyone else, whether they're people who look like you or not. And I think trying to be that part of that is really knowing what your voice is and what you're willing to do, and then also finding out ways that people might respond in a larger way to what you're doing, even if you're talking about watching a TV show with your parents, which is something I did for Vice recently. I watched, but it was we watched Game of Thrones, and it's okay. But it was mostly it was about my parents. But it was a lot of people read that piece and seemed to respond to it. But it was really is mostly my parents. It was about what they were doing. But it was also pegged to something.
I should mention too that the book that I'm mentioning in it involves cross-dressing Indian people in gay bars. An Indian woman who unwittingly takes pot brownies. I'm you want more than this to be happening to these Indian people?
Oh my God, tell me more.
I was I'm there wasn't enough going on in this for you?
We've had the stop sign, literally a stop sign being held up, and I think we have to kind of vacate the premises shortly. I could have talked to you guys all day, and I really wanted, to hear from you all as well. I'm so sorry that our time has run over. I hope you all enjoyed this lively discussion, and I think the main thing is as well, don't let anybody shave off your edges, okay? Your voice is very important, so as writers, just keep doing it.
I'm sorry, I shaved off your edges and I didn't hear a voice. I am sick and tired of reading books by South Asian authors that have these sassy grandmas who are there just for comic relief and making pickles.
It was actually very refreshingly prescriptive, because before that, the creative writing experience I had was either reading really bad manuscripts that we were going to publish anyway, or just taking these workshops where people are oh, well, go with that if you feel like it, but if you don't go with that. So it was very unhelpful.